Now we're going to talk about our whiskey and apple brandies. Our whiskey line includes bourbon and rye. We also have a limited release Burnt Rock bourbon that comes out once a year, and it's a 1 barrel release that we do. It's a little bit different from our typical bourbon that we make. So let's start with our bourbon. Our Mad River bourbon is a 4-grain mash bill. Our mash bill consists of 70% heirloom Vermont corn, 10% wheat, which lends to its beautiful sweetness and softness. It's going to be 10% barley, which adds this really nice malty, creamy note, and the oats. 10% oats, which is what makes it really unique. We're not using any rye. We're using oats. That gives it a really nice, long, lasting finish, and also adds to the creaminess and mouthfeel of the bourbon. Our bourbon is aged, again, in the same new American white oak charred barrels at a level number 3. They're aged for around 24 months, but sometimes up to 3 years. Our tasting notes on this are vanilla and spice from our American oak. You get a really nice roast corn note as well as granola. I get a little bit of a sweet banana bread as well. But there's endless flavors that come in this bourbon. It's a really complex, really unique bourbon. It's coming in at 46%, so for that amount of spirit, it is definitely a really smooth, sippable bourbon. For cocktail applications, I definitely recommend decadent creamy style cocktails with egg white, so a classic whiskey sour with egg white and some Angostura bitters on top is beautiful. A bourbon toddy would be excellent with some fresh lemon juice and honey and bitters in the winter and fall. And definitely any stirred whiskey cocktails, bourbon forward cocktails, old fashions, Manhattans, and the like would be beautiful with this bourbon. Once a year we do come out with our limited release Burnt Rock bourbon, which is here, and you'll see it's a little bit darker than our classic bourbon. It's also a little bit cloudier, and that's because we're using 70% again of that corn, or sorry, 75% of the heirloom Vermont corn, and then 15% of it is rye, and then 15% of it is Maplewood smoked barley. We use a company called Valley Malt in Hadley, Mass. that we go to roast and malt our grains. We use that as well in our rye. And for this one, you get this beautiful, smoky, rich characteristic. It's a beautiful sipping bourbon. It has this beautiful campfire note, burnt sugar, creme brulee, sweet cinnamon. I get a little bit of a capsicum, red bell pepper note as well. It's a really unique, savory, rich, smoky bourbon. Definitely something not to miss. We do release it only once a year, and it's very limited. And you can find it on our website where it's available, and you can purchase a bottle. Usually around November through January is available. Next, we have our Revolution Rye. This is one of my favorite products in the line. It's an absolutely beautiful rye because we're using 100% locally sourced rye grains from Massachusetts, Vermont, and New York. And 10 to 15% of the rye is a varietal called chocolate rye. Now, chocolate rye is when we take it to the same place that I was talking to you about called Valley Malt in Hadley, and they malt and roast that rye, and that brings out these beautiful chocolate mocha coffee flavors, and that's where you get all those notes in the rye. This is again aged for about an average of 12 months, sometimes up to 3 years, depending on the year. We have some beautiful tasting notes. It's incredibly complex rye. It's 48%, so it definitely packs a punch, but it is so complex, it's almost like a cocktail in a bottle. We have some beautiful tasting notes, green bell pepper, herbal notes. You get fresh cacao bean, roasted espresso, mocha, chocolate mint, some really nice spice notes. It's a super robust rye, has a really long finish, and it's something that you're never gonna forget the first time you taste it. It's definitely a beautiful representation of what local Vermont rye can taste like. So I highly recommend this rye. Sipping this rye on its own is absolutely gorgeous on the rocks, but in cocktails, it is absolutely phenomenal. So I would definitely mix this with bitter, rich, dark Amaros. like a Verna, Maletti, Amaro Nino. Substitute this instead of gin and a Negroni to make a Boulevardier style cocktail. It mixes really well with the Campari and the bitter citrus notes. And any sort of Manhattan style variation, old fashioned. Also in dessert cocktails, it is incredible in espresso martini or with coffee on its own, with coffee bitters. It's incredibly versatile. Definitely try mixing with this. It also holds up to really strong woodsy herbs like rosemary and thyme. And I would definitely mix with citruses like grapefruit, orange juice, and really rich style citruses as well. Another thing that we do with our company is something called Hopscotch. Now Hopscotch is another limited release, just like our Burnt Rock Bourbon here. The Hopscotch is something that we do as a collaboration with beer companies, usually local to Vermont. We've worked with Von Trapp, and our latest release is with Oktoberfest Otter Creek, which is out of Vermont as well. And we actually distill directly from their wort or fermentation that turns into their beer. And so it's usually a single malted whiskey. So it's going to be a really rich, kind of slightly hoppy, toffee, caramelly style of whiskey. That's going to be related to what we're using now, which is our Oktoberfest, which is now available. And next year we'll release another version of it. So that's another kind of one-off that we do, and the only one-offs that we do are the Burnt Rock Bourbon and the Hopscotch. The last thing in our spirits line is our Mad Apple Brandy. So this is a beautiful apple brandy. This is a kind of a mix between a French style apple brandy and an American style apple brandy. John Egan, Maura Connolly, the founder's husband, was really passionate and loves a beautiful dry Calvados and wanted to really bring that to Vermont. So they're using local heirloom style apples from Vermont. Now these apples are going to be a little bit drier, smaller, not the typical apples that you're going to eat. These are cider apples. Now cider apples are going to be really rich in tannins, and they're really great for fermentation and distillation, the same style of apples that they use in Calvados, France. So that's where we get our Calvados style, but where we're kind of mashing it up with the American style is we're using new charred American oak barrels, the same American oak barrels that we use for the rest of our spirits, and that gives it that really rich vanilla spice characteristic. Whereas when you're in Calvados and drinking their apple brandy, it's going to be less of an oak influence. They're using a Limousin oak, so it doesn't impart as much oak flavor as the American oak does. So this is really a beautiful collaboration between American and French apple brandy, and it's aged for a total of 2 years. It has a beautiful dry apple punch in the nose and then also in the mouthfeel, but also drinks a little bit like a whiskey. It has a nice smooth vanilla note and some beautiful rich baking spice notes like cinnamon, vanilla, and nutmeg. For cocktails, one of the most famous cocktails with citrus is my favorite is the Jack Rose. It's apple brandy, fresh pomegranate grenadine, and lemon juice, just shaken straight up. You can also enhance that cocktail by adding different types of bitters to it, or absinthe to kind of cut the sweetness and turn it into another classic cocktail called a Pan American Clipper. Also, don't knock it until you try it in a hot apple toddy. So you're gonna just mix it with fresh lemon juice, honey. You can add some bitters to it and hot water. It's great sitting by the fire and sipping on this when you're cold or have a cold or around family. And also really beautiful and sparkling cocktails. So any sort of champagne cocktail with citrus and honey, or citrus and maple, citrus and another fruit, and then top it with champagne or cava or prosecco. And I also recommend split basing this with other spirits. So we had our maple castrum that we talked about earlier. This would be really fun in a split base with this, a split base with our bourbon, a split base even with our vanilla rum would be really unique. So endless applications with apple brandy. Enjoy. And last but not least, we have the newest addition to the Mad River line, our 200 milliliter pre-made old fashions in a bottle. These are really fun. These are so fun for gifts, for gift packs, for just taking on a hike or around with your friends around a campfire. So these are basically old fashions mixed, and this is a double cocktail. It's 200 milliliters, so it's just over 6 ounces. We have it with our maple cask rum. We have one with our bourbon and one with our rye, and we're using all natural and organic local bitters and flavorings. The Demerara sugar syrup that we're using is made by Maura at her house. It's the same Demerara sugar that they use to make the rum. And they're absolutely fun. Definitely give them a try. Unique and exciting to have as an addition to our line. Cheers, enjoy.